Hi, welcome to today's video. My name is Paul. So this week again, I thought maybe to do a sort of demo video. I know I did one of these just a couple of weeks ago, but it seemed to be popular, so I thought maybe I'll have a go at another one. But I wanted to focus a little bit more on the initial stages maybe. So I said in the last video that I don't use photographic references. But one of the things I do is I have a number of sketchbooks that I fill up with these little thumbnail sketches, and they're almost like scribbles really. They make sense to me, but maybe not to many other people looking at them. And you can see an example page on the left hand side of the screen with 4 of these very loose thumbnails. And then sometimes I'll take a thumbnail and expand it up to fill out the page on the sketchbook, just as an idea, something that I can then maybe turn into a painting. And you can see that an example on the right hand side. Now I'm not using this as a reference. When I start painting, I don't have this in front of me and I'm not trying to copy it. And the reason for doing that is I want the final painting to be very loose, somewhat abstract. And as soon as you start copying anything, any sort of reference, whether it's a sketch or a photograph, whatever it is, once you start copying, you immediately start to tighten up, because you start to think, well, the line goes down here and then it goes up there. And once you start doing that, you slow down, you tighten up, and everything, the final painting will look different. It won't look very loose or very abstract. So I'm not saying that it's wrong to do that, or the way I do it is right, or anything like that. I'm just saying that I try to get a loose, somewhat abstract landscape. And so to do that, I don't copy anything. I just make it up as I go along. And I think that helps to loosen up the final painting. But anyway, that's the sort of initial stages that I go through. And I do have lots of sketchbooks just filled with these little scribbly thumbnail sketches. They're good to keep. Obviously these sort of sketchbooks, you're not showing other people, it's not finished artwork, but they're good to keep because you can look through them and it will maybe inspire you later on to create a painting from one of those little thumbnails. Or you may take one of them and adjust it a little bit and play around with it and come up with new ideas. Of course, the sketchbook doesn't have to be anything fancy, just a basic sketchbook. And I usually just use pencil or a piece of charcoal just to create the little sketches, little thumbnail sketches. But anyway, once got past that initial stage, start putting some paint down onto the paper, and you can see my initial idea was to create sort of the idea of distant hills, and I wanted to use some aerial perspective, or some people call it atmospheric perspective, the idea that the more distant hills are slightly bluish. So I mixed some blue and green to get that sort of turquoise, put it onto the paper, and immediately didn't like it. So that's why you saw me there using just some water in the brush, painting on just to get rid of most of that turquoise pigment. And you'll see in a minute or so, I start to develop a different idea. So instead of having these very distant hills, sort of bluish green, I decided that the hills would be much closer and you'd be able to see some detail on the hills. So the hedgerows, dividing that hill up into individual fields. Again, I don't have any references and things, so I'm making it up as I go along. If I'm not happy with the pattern that's emerging, I will change it. I don't have any problems with changing things halfway through the painting. As I've said before, I don't see painting as a very linear sort of process. It's a bit more organic or disorganized, depending which way you want to look at it. But I don't have any problems. It may be just a personality thing. Some people maybe want more control over the painting process. I like a bit of chaos. But anyway, I keep trying. different lines, different patterns. And it is, from a compositional design point of view, it is just creating a pattern of fields. We're just taking that strip of paper and dividing it up into something that I think looks interesting. So once I've sort of established that pattern of fields, I can then start working on the middle ground and the foreground. So now I start using some of that cadmium yellow. I always like to use a bit of cadmium yellow because I think it brightens everything up, and it's a sort of a happy color, I guess. As I paint it on, some of the blue that's already on is going to mix, and you're going to get slight greens forming and things. Plus, of course, the paper is still damp, so some of the blue and the yellow, where they meet, they're going to mix a little bit. All of that's fine. The next stage then is to start working on the foreground. And in the foreground, I'm going to put in some detail, and this is sort of repeating what I've said before, especially in that video a couple of weeks ago. I create this sort of implied detail in the foreground because that helps to separate the foreground from the middle ground and the background, which don't have that sort of detail. And by doing that, you're creating a sense of depth in the painting. Maybe one other thing to point out is brush strokes. So in the background, the middle ground, they tend to be a lot of horizontal brush strokes. But if you look in the foreground, they tend to be more vertical and maybe sort of diagonal as well. And it's just because if you think about the way the vegetation grows, it grows upwards or somewhat upwards. So that's why the brush strokes are going that way. In the middle ground and the distance, your eyes can't resolve individual blades of grass and things, so just horizontal strokes are fine, just to fill in that bit of paper with some pigment. This next bit, so I watched a video recently where the guy said you shouldn't do any sort of dabbing or anything with watercolor. It must all be very fluid brush strokes, which is his opinion, and that's fine. And he's talking about the way he's painting. The only thing I don't like is the idea that you mustn't do this or you should do this. Or we all do it our own little way, and if you're happy with the final results that you're getting, that's fine. But my message would be, try whatever you want. And this sort of dabbing on the brush, I got this idea just from Impressionism, where they used a lot of broken brushwork to sometimes create a feeling of detail, sort of what I call implied detail. So this little dabs of color and things, the viewer will look at this and they may interpret it as vegetation of some kind, flowers maybe, or something like that. So I'm just doing enough to let the viewer interpret what they're saying, rather than sort of spoon feeding the viewer and saying this is a flower and actually painting and drawing a flower. I'm just suggesting something and they fill in the blanks, kind of thing. I left the background, the hills, to dry, and now that the paint is reasonably dry, I can start putting on some color onto those fields. Just using very, very gentle brush strokes, because although the pigment has dried into the paper, the wet brush could sort of reactivate the paint and then it would all get smeared and turn into a mess, really. So it's just very gently brushing on the yellow and green pigment onto the paper. And then this is scan of the final painting. Because of the way I paint, And it's the same sort of with Impressionist paintings. They tend to look better if you stand back and look at them. When you do a scan that sort of focuses in, I think it doesn't look just as good as the final painting does in real life. But it does help to show up some of the details, and you can see the scratch marks and where I dabbed the paint on and things. And you can see the sort of broken lines. So those blue hedgerows, they're not continuous heavy lines, they're broken up, and some places they disappear and then reappear, and those sort of lost and found edges can add a bit of interest into the painting as well. I think if you just have heavy solid lines, you end up with a sort of grid work and it doesn't look as natural, I think. Anyway, that's the way I'm looking at it. Okay, well, if you made it this far, thank you for watching as always, and hopefully it was of some interest and use. As I said, I don't want to keep doing these demos in case I start to repeat myself, but I thought it might be interesting to show you some of the initial stages in those very loose scribbly thumbnail sketches and how I turned that into the final painting. So again, thank you for watching, and hopefully see you in the next video.